Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're immersing ourselves in just an absolutely epic story. It's one that has shaped the moral and theological framework for billions across three faiths. The conflict between Moses, or Musa, and Pharaoh.
It really is the ultimate allegory, isn't it? For power, for justice, and for what happens when human arrogance comes up against divine will.
Exactly. And when we dive into the sources for this, we're pulling from the Quran, especially Surah Al Qasas, alongside centuries of commentary and, of course, modern archaeological scrutiny. We see it's not just ancient history.
No, not at all. It feels more like we're analyzing a blueprint, a kind of sophisticated guide for resisting tyranny.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our mission today is to try and synthesize these views, pull out the really surprising historical details, the little nuggets of knowledge, and navigate that deep tension between faith and the persistent silence in the archaeological record.
And we have to keep that balance. I mean, for many people, this story is a core belief, but it's also one of the most rigorously debated historical narratives on Earth.
Right.
So we're here to understand the claims, the counterclaims, and the universal lessons buried inside it all.
So let's start with the biggest question. Why this story? The Moses narrative is all over Scripture, but the sources really emphasize the context of Surah Al Qasas. Why was it revealed right then? What was the message for that first audience?
The why is everything. You see, these verses were revealed in Makkah.
During the really tough times for the early Muslims.
The absolute toughest. They were a small, weak, persecuted minority. The Prophet was facing just relentless harassment, existential threats from the powerful Quraysh elite.
So the environment itself mirrored the story being told.
Precisely. The Quraysh were the establishment. They were the dominant, wealthy tribe in Makkah, guardians of the Kaaba, holding all this social and economic power.
And so by telling the story of Moses,
God was offering this profound consolation. It was a historical parallel. Moses faced Pharaoh, a tyrant with what seemed like absolute power. And yet, truth won. The oppressor was utterly destroyed. It was a very clear warning to the Quraysh that their arrogance would lead them down the exact same path.
You know, the second purpose I find just as compelling, establishing the divine origin of the message itself. The sources point out that the Quranic version has this intimate, detailed knowledge, even private conversations happening inside Pharaoh's palace.
It's the ultimate theological proof, you could say. I mean, how could an unlettered Arab in 7th century Arabia possibly know these specific, granular details about the Egyptian court from 1,000 years before?
Unless it was a revelation.
That's the argument. That specificity is the theological anchor.
Now, what's fascinating is that for all that specificity, the Quran consistently uses the title Pharaoh, but it never names the man. Why do that? Why the ambiguity?
Because it shifts the focus. It moves it from a single historical guide to the archetype of tyranny.
Ah, I see.
It makes the lesson universal. It applies to any time, any place where a ruler has power without accountability. The specific name, it just matters less than the flaw in the position itself.
And yet we love trying to nail down the name. Historians, archaeologists. Who are the leading candidates when scholars try to pin this to a specific Egyptian king?
The debate almost always centers on the powerful 19th dynasty of Egypt. The time frame, the context, it just fits the best. And the most popular candidate, I'd say, among modern scholars is Ramesses II.
Ramesses the Great.
The very one.
He ruled for, 66 years?
Yeah.
Known for these massive monuments, he would be the quintessential pharaoh of oppression.
He absolutely fits the bill. A king engaged in enormous building projects that would require forced labor on an immense scale. When we hear about the enslaved Israelites building cities for Pharaoh,
You think of him.
scholars immediately point to the construction of his capital, Pi-Ramesses, in the Nile Delta. The architectural evidence lines up perfectly with a period of intense, sustained, forced labor by Semitic peoples.
But the theory often have two parts, right? There's the oppressor, and then there's the one who drowns in the sea.
That's where his son, Meneptah, often enters the picture. Some scholars propose Ramesses II was the long-ruling oppressor, and Meneptah was the king who came after, the one who perished in the Red Sea, the pharaoh of the Exodus.
So either way, we're talking about the late Bronze Age.
Firmly, roughly 1300 to 1200 BCE.
Okay, and before we move on, we have to clarify one huge misconception. Moses didn't just show up from somewhere else to save the Jews.
That is an absolutely crucial clarification. Moses was born among the enslaved Israelites in Egypt.
Right.
They weren't recent arrivals. Their ancestors had settled there generations earlier, back in the time of the prophet Joseph or Yusuf. Moses' mission was to liberate his own people from a systemic slavery imposed on them. His entire story is framed by that origin, from within the oppressed community.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me, the transmission of this story. We know the basic outline was already floating around among Arabs before Islam. You had Jewish tribes in Medina, Christian communities.
Yes, the basic framework was known. But this is where the Quran steps in and really transforms the narrative. It doesn't hide that these other accounts exist.
It uses them.
It uses them as a springboard. It claims to be correcting the details that were, corrupted or lost over time. It basically challenges the listener, saying, you had the outline, but this is the authoritative, revealed truth.
The text itself says, "You were not on the western side of the mount when we decreed the command to Moses." It's almost cinematic, like saying, I was there, you weren't.
Exactly. It uses what's known to validate the specific details of the revelation. And this brings us right to that core tension we mentioned earlier.
The faith narrative versus the academic archaeological view.
The big one.
So we have to address the elephant in the historical room, the silence of archaeology. When experts dig in Egypt, what do they find? Or maybe what don't they find?
Well, mainstream archaeology has found no direct conclusive evidence.
Nothing.
No inscription mentioning Moses, no mass grave of an army, no logistical trail for a mass exodus of millions of people. But the reason for that silence is in itself a crucial historical lesson.
Which is?
Egyptian pharaohs were historians of success, they just didn't record their failures.
Right, of course.
Defeats, domestic crises, plagues, you won't find those on the temple walls. Their monuments were about their power, not documents of national embarrassment. So the absence of evidence for a huge defeat is, well, it's exactly what you'd expect from their political propaganda.
That makes perfect sense. They weren't about to carve propaganda in stone, highlighting the time they lost their entire slave labor force and their army.
Precisely. However, the silence isn't total. Historians do confirm the presence and later subjugation of Semitic peoples in Egypt. And we have one incredible piece of indirect evidence that really changes the game.
And it is the Merneptah stele.
Yes, the Merneptah stele dates to about 1208 BCE. It's an inscription, basically a victory monument from Pharaoh Merneptah Ramesses II's son. And here is the nugget. It contains the first known extra-biblical historical mention of the word Israel.
And the implication of that is it's profound.
It's monumental.
Yeah.
This stone artifact, written by the pharaoh's own scribes, confirms that a people called Israel were established in the region of Canaan right around the time the Exodus narrative is traditionally set.
So it means that by 1208 BCE,
Israel had gone from being internal slaves inside Egypt to an external, established regional enemy that the pharaoh felt the need to boast about defeating. It corroborates their existence right at that intersection of history and scripture.
So, given this huge chasm Scripture's conviction versus the physical silence, how have people tried to bridge that gap? You mentioned those three main viewpoints.
Right. So first you have the literal historical view. This is held by traditional believers. For them, the Exodus happened exactly as described, miracles and all.
And the lack of evidence.
It just points to the limits of our current science. Or maybe the Egyptians deliberately hid it.
Okay, then there's the more skeptical view.
That's the symbolic or mythological view. Some modern scholars hold this. They argue the story is an ancient folk memory, maybe based on small skirmishes, that got exaggerated and theologized over centuries to create a national identity.
So when the text mentions millions of people, they see that as
a theological motif, a symbol for an entire people, not a literal head count.
And the middle ground, where most Egyptologists seem to sit.
That's the kernel of history idea. They'd suggest it's highly probable a smaller group of Semites, maybe a clan of laborers or nomadic groups who are always moving in and out of the Delta, did manage to leave Egypt.
An escape.
A daring escape, maybe? And that event was later amplified, given a theological structure by later generations, to become the grand narrative we know. It says something happened, just not necessarily on that massive supernatural scale.
This brings us perfectly to the specific, tiny details that critics love to seize on. The Quranic account has a couple of famous ones. The identity of Haman and the use of burnt bricks.
Yes, these little details become battlegrounds. Let's start with the Haman argument. Critics have used this for generations to claim the Quran made a huge historical mistake.
The argument being that the Quran confuses Pharaoh's minister, Haman, with the Haman from the biblical book of Esther,
Who lived in Persia almost 1,000 years later.
Yeah.
It's a powerful criticism on the surface.
Yeah.
It implies this massive chronological error. But this is where modern scholarship, based on archaeological finds, offers a really staggering counter-argument.
Okay.
Muslim scholars point to the discovery of ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs, specifically the term
And that translates to...
It translates roughly to head of the quarry workers, a master builder, an administrative title. And the incredible thing is that this title fits the Quranic story perfectly.
Because Pharaoh asks Haman to build a tower.
Exactly, a lofty tower. This linguistic find suggests the Quran used an accurate ancient Egyptian administrative title that would have been completely unknown to Arabs in the 7th century. It just flips the entire criticism on its head.
That is genuinely surprising. That's a level of detail that goes way beyond common knowledge at the time.
Absolutely. And the second big controversy is about the material used for that very tower. Pharaoh tells Haman to kindle for me a fire upon the clay to make bricks.
And critics said that's wrong, that Egyptians used mud bricks, not fired bricks.
Right. They argued that baked or burnt bricks were an anachronism. But again, archaeological nuance proves the detail correct. While the common building material was unbaked mud, archaeologists confirm that fired bricks were known in that period.
But they were rare.
Very rare. Expensive. They required huge amounts of fuel and labor, so you'd reserve them for specific, high-status, enduring structures.
Like the colossal, boastful tower Pharaoh wanted to build to reach the sky.
Precisely. The detail implies he wasn't asking for just any old structure. He was asking for something monumental, technologically challenging, to show off his hubris. The specificity of the material becomes a sign of accuracy, not an error.
Wow.
It ties the detail right back to the theme of arrogance.
This whole deep dive shows the story is a battleground of specifics. But at the end of the day, what does this story mean for us now? I mean, its resilience has to be about more than just historical debate. It's about the moral lessons.
The lessons are absolutely timeless. I think first and foremost is the simple, devastating truth that power without accountability, it inevitably leads to tyranny and self-destruction.
Pharaoh's arrogance.
His belief that he was the highest authority, it's the ultimate warning against unchecked human ego.
You know, I think we also need to slow down and really appreciate the roles the women play in this story. They're often overlooked, but they are the real agents of change here.
They facilitate Moses' entire mission. You have his mother, who shows the ultimate crust tawakkul by following a divine command to put her baby in a river.
Unbelievable faith.
Then his sister's courage, watching over the basket. But maybe most courageously, you have Pharaoh's own wife, Azia.
She saves him from her own husband, the most powerful man on earth.
It's a radical decision. She sacrifices everything, her safety, her status, probably her life, to protect this vulnerable child, knowing he is a threat to her husband's entire kingdom. She is the ultimate example of moral courage inside the lion's den.
And finally, we should probably touch on the modern attempts to link faith with scientific discoveries. The preservation of Pharaoh's body is a famous one.
Yes, that claim comes from a verse in Surah Yunus, where God tells Pharaoh his body will be saved as a sign for future generations. Many believers cite this as being fulfilled by the discovery of the mummies of Ramesses II, or Merneptah.
Some of which show signs of what could be drowning.
Right. It's a very compelling claim for believers looking for that harmony between scripture and science. But we should note that mainstream scientists and Egyptologists generally see these links as post hoc interpretations, trying to fit a discovery to a pre-existing belief. The spiritual lesson, that the tyrant's body would survive not as a monument to his glory, but as a humiliated example, that's the primary point, whether we can identify the specific mummy or not.
So this deep dive, it's really shown that the story of Moses and Pharaoh operates on so many levels at once. It's a bedrock article of faith, it's a key historical parallel for comfort, and it's this complex, archaeologically debated story that has just shaped our entire understanding of justice and power.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, given that both the Quran and the Torah deliberately leave the specific pharaoh anonymous, they focus on the title, the role, the tyranny. It raises an important question, doesn't it?
Which
is the true, enduring lesson of the story in the spectacular miracles? Or is it in the profound theological statement that the specific name of the tyrant ultimately matters less than the inevitable fate of the tyranny itself? That's something for you to mull or explore on your own.